I thought I was going into a normal dentist appointment. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a sharp toothache that had been bothering me for a few days. The dentist examined my mouth, smiled, and said it would likely be a simple procedure. I relaxed in the chair, thinking I would be finished in less than an hour. But then everything changed. Halfway through the procedure, my dentist suddenly froze. The color drained from his face. He slowly stepped back and stared at the screen beside me. Then he looked directly into my eyes and said words I will never forget. "We need to call 911 right now." At first, I laughed nervously. I thought he was kidding. It was only a toothache, right? But when he turned the monitor toward me and said, "This isn't about your teeth," I felt my whole body go cold. It all began on a Tuesday morning. I had been ignoring a dull pain in the back of my jaw for almost a week. At first, I blamed stress. Then I figured maybe I had bitten down too hard on something. But when the pain started spreading into my neck and causing headaches, I decided to schedule an emergency dentist appointment. The clinic was quiet, and everything felt routine. I checked in, sat in the waiting room scrolling through my phone, and after about 10 minutes, they called my name. The dentist greeted me politely and asked a few questions. I explained the pain, expecting him to tell me I had a cavity or maybe needed a root canal. He nodded and said he wanted to take an x-ray first. Nothing seemed unusual. A few minutes later, he pulled the image onto the screen and stared at it much longer than I expected. I noticed his expression slowly change, but I assumed he was simply examining the tooth more carefully. He told me he wanted to begin cleaning the infected area before discussing the treatment plan again. Everything seemed completely normal, so I leaned back and let him continue working. About 5 minutes into the procedure, I felt him suddenly stop. There was no warning, no explanation, just complete silence. Then I opened my eyes and saw him staring at the x-ray again. I asked, "Is everything okay?" He didn't reply right away. Instead, he slowly removed his gloves and walked toward the phone mounted on the wall. That was the first moment I truly felt afraid. I sat up in the chair and asked again, this time a little louder, "What's going on?" Then he turned toward me and said, "I need you to stay calm, but I'm calling emergency services." I remember laughing because I honestly believed it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. I said, "Doctor, it's literally just a toothache." But his next sentence changed everything. He pointed toward a dark shadow visible beneath my jawbone on the x-ray and said, "No, this isn't your tooth." Everything seemed completely normal, so I leaned back in the chair and let him continue his work. About 5 minutes into the procedure, I noticed him suddenly freeze. There was no warning, no explanation, just complete silence filling the room. Then I opened my eyes and saw him staring at the x-ray again with a very serious look on his face. I asked, "Is everything okay?" He didn't reply right away. Instead, he slowly took off his gloves and walked toward the phone attached to the wall. That was the exact moment real fear started to sink in. I sat up in the chair and asked again, this time much louder, "What's happening?" He turned toward me, took a deep breath, and said, "I need you to stay calm, but I'm calling emergency services." I actually laughed because I truly believed there had to be some kind of mistake. I looked at him and said, "Doctor, it's only a toothache." But the next words that came out of his mouth changed my life forever. He pointed toward a dark shadow showing beneath my jawbone on the x-ray and quietly said, "No, this isn't your tooth. There is a large, abnormal mass pressing against the major blood vessels in your neck." My stomach dropped instantly. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen as I tried to understand what I was seeing. To me, it looked like nothing more than blurry shapes and random shadows. But to him, it was something very serious. Something that needed immediate attention. He explained that whatever was growing inside my neck had probably been getting bigger for several months without causing obvious symptoms. The pressure from the mass was now affecting the nerves connected to my jaw, which was why I believed the pain was coming from a bad tooth. But the most dangerous part was its location. It was sitting dangerously close to the blood vessels supplying blood to my brain. If it shifted even a little, it could block blood flow, cause me to lose consciousness, or even lead to something much worse. Everything suddenly felt unreal. Just minutes earlier, I had been thinking about getting home after having a simple dental procedure. Now I was sitting there wondering if I was facing a life-threatening emergency. Within a few minutes, paramedics arrived at the dental clinic. I still remember sitting in that chair surrounded by people I had never met before, while my mind kept replaying the events of the morning. I had walked through those doors expecting nothing more than a routine visit to fix what I thought was a painful tooth. Instead, I was being placed on a stretcher and rushed to the hospital, wondering if my life was hanging by a thread. The ambulance ride felt strangely quiet. I could hear the sound of equipment moving around me and the voices of the paramedics speaking calmly, but everything else felt distant. My thoughts were racing faster than I could control them. Questions filled my mind one after another. How could a simple toothache turn into something like this? How had nobody noticed it before? How long had this thing been growing inside me without any warning? At the hospital, doctors wasted no time. Specialists ordered several scans immediately. Nurses moved quickly from one machine to another, while doctors reviewed images on computer screens. Every minute felt longer than the last. I kept searching their faces for answers, hoping someone would smile and tell me everything was fine. Instead, several hours later, a surgeon walked into my room with a serious expression that immediately told me this was no small problem. He confirmed exactly what my dentist had suspected. Hidden deep inside the soft tissue of my neck was a rapidly growing cyst-like mass. It wasn't just sitting there harmlessly. It was pressing against important structures, including major blood vessels and nearby nerves. If it had continued growing without treatment, it could have caused catastrophic complications within just a few days. Then the surgeon said something that I still think about all the time. "If you had ignored that tooth pain for another week," he said, "there's a very real chance you wouldn't be sitting here today." I just stared at him without saying a word. Those words echoed in my mind over and over again. A random toothache had literally saved my life. Not because the tooth itself was the problem, but because the pain forced me to visit someone who happened to notice something no one else had ever seen. For months, I had gone about my normal routine. I went to work, spent time with friends, laughed, made plans, and lived every day believing I was completely healthy. All that time, something dangerous had been silently growing inside my neck without giving me any obvious warning signs. Looking back now, I realized there had been tiny clues that I had ignored. There were moments when my jaw felt unusually sore. Sometimes swallowing felt slightly uncomfortable. I occasionally woke up with stiffness in my neck, but I blamed it on sleeping in a strange position. None of those symptoms seemed important enough to worry about. Now, every one of them suddenly made sense. The surgery was scheduled for the very next morning. That night was one of the longest nights of my entire life. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that dark shadow on the X-ray. I kept wondering what would happen if the operation didn't go as planned. I thought about my family, my future, and all the things I still wanted to do. It was impossible not to imagine every possible outcome. When morning arrived, the medical team prepared me for surgery. Everyone remained calm and professional, but I could feel the seriousness of the situation in every conversation around me. The operation lasted several hours. When I finally woke up in recovery, the first thing I saw was my family standing nearby with tears in their eyes. The surgeons smiled gently and told me the procedure had been successful. They had removed the mass before it caused permanent damage. Relief washed over me in a way I can't fully describe. Recovery wasn't easy. It took several weeks before I felt like myself again. There were follow-up appointments, medications, physical discomfort, and plenty of time to think about everything that had happened. More than anything else, I kept thinking about how incredibly close I had come to never discovering the real problem. One small decision had changed everything. If I had decided to wait another week because I was too busy, if I had taken more painkillers instead of making the appointment, if I had convinced myself the pain would eventually disappear, I might never have learned what was really happening inside my body until it was too late. That thought still sends chills through me. It's amazing how quickly life can change. One ordinary morning became one of the most important days I have ever lived through. I walked into the dentist's office expecting nothing more than a simple procedure. I walked out surrounded by emergency responders and on my way to surgery that ultimately saved my life. Even now, every dental appointment reminds me of that day. I no longer see routine checkups as something inconvenient. I see them as reminders that trained professionals sometimes notice problems we could never recognize ourselves. Life has a strange way of sending warnings. Sometimes they come through pain. Sometimes they come through discomfort. Sometimes they appear in ways that make no sense until much later. I believed I had nothing more than a simple toothache, something millions of people brush off every single day. But hidden behind that pain was something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The most frightening part isn't what happened while I was sitting in that dental chair. The scariest part is realizing that if I had waited just a little longer, I might never have been given another chance. That experience completely changed how I listen to my body. I don't ignore unusual symptoms anymore. I don't automatically assume everything will fix itself. I've learned that even the smallest warning can sometimes point to something much bigger. Sometimes the pain you want to ignore is actually the signal that saves your life. So if your body keeps trying to tell you something, don't dismiss it too quickly. Pay attention. Ask questions. Get it checked. It may turn out to be something small, and that's the best possible outcome. But every once in a while, what seems like a minor problem can hide a danger you never expected. An ordinary day can become the day that changes your future forever. A simple appointment can become the reason you're still alive. And sometimes, the smallest pain hides the biggest danger, while the moment you almost ignore becomes the moment that gives you a second chance at life.